The states of the American Midwest have played an important role throughout American history as a center of political and economic change. Whether that be its role as an industrial heartland, the cradle of the early Republican Party, or the growing discontent of its population due to the deindustrialization of the region fueling the rise of modern populist politics. However, the Midwest was not always as central to America as it is today. In fact, during its early history under the United States government, the land was simply known as the Northwest Territory, with no state to speak of. The land itself was not largely occupied by American citizens, but rather by a series of tribes who felt under threat by the encroaching tides of white migration from the east. This would prompt many tribes to unite under the charismatic and tactfully skilled Native American Chief Tecumseh in what history would know as Tecumseh's Confederacy, a state which joined arms with the British against the United States during the War of 1812. There was a dream among those who followed Tecumseh of a union of Native American tribes in the Northwest Territory that would serve as a safe haven for Native Americans against the European colonizers. In our own timeline, while Tecumseh did see early victories in the war, he soon found himself and his people overwhelmed, with him later perishing in the war, along with the hope of a united Native state in the Northwest Territory. But what if that changed? What if in an alternate timeline, Tecumseh succeeded in his dream of a Native state? Hello audience, Mr. Z here with another alternate history scenario for you. If you're new to the channel, welcome and stay tuned. In today's day and age, data is valuable. Names, phone numbers, emails, there are people out there just looking to buy and sell what could be your information even against your own wishes. This is where today's sponsor, Aura, comes in. Aura is a one-stop shop for information security. First and foremost, Aura provides you the service of identifying these data brokers and submitting opt-out requests on your behalf to keep your information from changing hands. And as an added bonus, this will opt you out of those annoying junk mail and telemarketing lists. On top of that, Aura offers you the ability to monitor your personal information, including your passwords, and informs you of potential data breaches, including if your information is being shared on the dark web. Even more than that, Aura comes with a VPN, password manager, real-time credit and identity theft monitoring, and malware protection. Virtually every internet safety tool you'll ever need is at your disposal with Aura. Let Aura do the hard work of keeping you safe online. If you sign up right now with the link in the description, you can try Aura out for 2 weeks absolutely free. Go to aura.com/Monsieur to start your free trial today. Now, back to the video. The lands that would come to comprise the Northwest Territory came into the ownership of the British following the 7 Years' War, known more commonly in America as the French and Indian War, which brought about widespread change to the region's politics. This is because unlike the French, who largely just traded with the natives, the British colonists of America sought to settle the frontier just beyond the Appalachian Mountains. This would lead to what came to be known as Pontiac's War in 1763, when the Ottawa Indian chief Pontiac led a combined force of most Native Americans west of the Appalachians and east of the Mississippi into a campaign against the British and American settlers. This conflict led to the capture of most British forts and laid to waste any settlements they could find, with most white settlers in the region being killed. However, the war would become prolonged, leading Pontiac and the British to seek peace in an effort to limit the devastation. While Pontiac technically hadn't won the war, it did lead to a reorganization of colonial territory as Britain began to enforce the Proclamation of 1763, establishing a vast territory intended for exclusive native settlement. This, along with other instances of the British asserting more authority over the American colonies, would lead to the American War for Independence. During the war, many native tribes maintained a policy of indifference. However, those who did decide to take a side in the conflict often chose the British, who promised to protect their territory from colonial expansion. One of the largest of these groups which sided with the British would be the Northwest Indian Confederation, which was a loose alliance of several tribes who frequently conducted raids on American encampments. Regardless of their contributions, it would be the American colonial rebels who would ultimately achieve victory in the war. With the surrender of British forces at Yorktown, the war drew to a slow but violent close, with proceedings in France creating what came to be known as the Peace of Paris, which involved a series of treaties signed between Britain, America, and involved allies. However, within these proceedings, the Native American tribes were not present, foreign powers negotiating on their behalf instead. This further complicated the matter as many of the territorial boundaries set went unenforced, with the Northwest Territory itself contested by many states. But while the Americans bickered over the future of the country, many of the native tribes west of the Appalachians were still unsure of their standing with the new nation, ultimately leading to frequent conflict between settlers and natives, in many cases over the unknown boundary of the United States. Frequently, these conflicts would become retributive, with the Amur Indians raiding American forts and settlements, and Americans responding in kind, creating a cycle of violence. These raids were mainly conducted by the Northwest Indian Confederation, but other tribes such as the Iroquois and Algonquin and some members of the Creek, Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Choctaw also conducted several smaller-scale raids against American munitions stores. The creation of the Constitution and of a unified American nation settled the post-war fog of uncertainty, and now the foremost concern in the minds of many Americans became the status of the Northwest Territory. While in the South, treaties were peacefully negotiated with what came to be known as the Five Civilized Tribes, in the lands of the Northwest Territory, George Washington would launch one of the first expeditions of the new federal army into the territory. However, this expedition was ill-fated as the new soldiers were unprepared to enter into the difficult-to-navigate and heavily wooded territory of the Miami tribe, who themselves were a member of the Northwest Indian Confederation. There, a Miami chief by the name of Little Turtle would defeat the American army even though he was later forced to retreat due to the overwhelming number of Americans. The following year, further disasters struck when a second expedition was sent out, resulting in an 80% casualty rate for the Americans and a horrific defeat. Only after fully reorganizing the army were the Americans finally able to defeat the Northwest Indian Confederation at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, where the Americans achieved an astounding victory. With this defeat and the continuing war with Napoleon, the British would decide that their position in the Northwest Territory was untenable and evacuated their forts. Meanwhile, the Northwest Indian Confederacy would sign the Treaty of Greenville, which ceded most of their lands in present-day Ohio and several other territories to the United States. Following this treaty, Little Turtle, the very same chief who had first defeated the Americans and later encouraged an end to hostilities due to the bloodshed, advocated for cooperation with the United States. The only high-ranking man to stand firmly against this seeming concession was the war chief of the recently relocated Shawnee tribe, Tecumseh. Instead of advocating cooperation with the Americans, he would instead call for all native peoples to unify under a single confederacy and resist any incursions into their territory. Tecumseh was born in 1768 amid violence and bloodshed in what was at the time the Ohio country just west of the Appalachian Mountains. It was there that his father was killed by American settlers and at the young age of 7 that his mother left him. However, he would find solace in his siblings who would raise him in the traditional Shawnee ways, teaching him a strict code of honesty along with several other practical skills such as hunting. Eventually, he was adopted by the Shawnee chief Blackfish, who raised him for the remainder of his boyhood years. It would be during these early years that Tecumseh gained what would come to be a deeply instilled hatred of whites, and it would also be during this time that he would travel alongside Blackfish on raids against Americans during the War for Independence. Following the Revolutionary War, he would continue to lead raids on white settlements in the Northwest Territory, gaining him acclaim and eventually leading him to be chosen as the leader of the Shawnee. The wars of the Northwest Indian Confederacy eventually came about, and Tecumseh played a small role in the Battle of Fallen Timbers, where he would see one of his brothers killed. The ensuing meeting at Greenville would be where he would gain notoriety among the tribes for refusing to recognize the treaty on the basis that all land was held in common ownership by all Native Americans. Even the Americans were impressed by his oratorical skills, comparing him to the rising Henry Clay among other prominent politicians. Despite this, many of the Shawnee would abandon Tecumseh following the treaty for his refusal of it. Shortly after this, Tecumseh would reunite with his brother Tenskwatawa, a young Shawnee who was not proficient at hunting or fighting, and mocked by the rest of the tribe, but who in 1805 would receive several religious visions from the so-called Master of Life, who had named him a prophet. Tenskwatawa's teachings often revolved around rejecting all things European, fueling what came to be known as the Purification Movement, which included banning marriages between Native Americans and whites. Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa soon found their ideas aligned, forging a pan-nativist and anti-European movement, which would lead to the founding of the settlement of Prophetstown in the lands of the Miami, which would come to be the headquarters for what came to be known as Tecumseh's Confederacy. The settlement would grow as Tenskwatawa's accurate prediction of a solar eclipse led many to believe that he truly was a prophet. Tecumseh also helped bolster the town's numbers by traveling across America and gaining vast recruits for the new Confederacy. During this time, however, the Americans were not idle in the Northwest Territories, as the governor of the Indiana Territory, later President William Henry Harrison, had managed to gradually expand American territory in the region through the Treaty of Fort Wayne. In addition, Harrison, knowing of the potential threat Prophetstown posed to American interests in the region, along with the threat posed by Tecumseh's pan-nativist ideology, would negotiate treaties that aligned several once friendly native tribes against Tecumseh's growing Confederacy at Prophetstown. On November 6, 1811, Harrison would lead an expedition toward Prophetstown and set up camp outside. This expedition was not without timing, as it was done while Tecumseh was away, leaving the militarily inept Tenskwatawa to lead a poor first attack against Harrison's forces. This battle, later named the Battle of Tippecanoe, would be what ultimately ended Tecumseh's Confederacy, as the loss led much of the population to scatter. Tecumseh, undeterred however, would still assemble a significant force, potentially the largest single force of Native Americans ever assembled, and fight alongside the British in hopes of creating a pan-nativist state. However, the idea would die along with Tecumseh when Harrison's forces defeated him along with his British allies. Slowly but surely, the Northwest Territory was parceled into states as it became an integral part of the United States, eventually fueling the industrial growth that would turn it into an economic and military superpower. But this time, things are different. If we re-examine the history of the Northwest Territory and Tecumseh himself, we find that the key factor which prevented the success was Harrison, who established the Treaty of Fort Wayne and turned many of the tribes against what seemed to be the largest single united tribal confederation in terms of manpower established within the region. In addition to this, the lack of clearly defined leadership between Tecumseh and Tippecanoe and the founding of Prophetstown likely also prevented the natives from sufficiently preparing themselves with modern arms, which couldn't have been supplied by the British due to Tippecanoe's purification movement. Let's assume for the sake of this timeline that Harrison's attempt to establish the Treaty of Fort Wayne fails, with the invited tribes, primarily the Miami, refusing to cede land to the Americans. This would have prompted an attack on several native settlements during 1809, leading to a widespread outcry on the part of the tribes for unity against the Americans. With Tecumseh as a unifying figure, he'd successfully bring together many of the tribes in the region, including the Shawnee. Given his abilities as a war leader during the War of 1812, he would be able to win the battle against what would be a numerically inferior force sent by Harrison. This outcome would trigger an early War of 1812, taking on a far different character, with the Native Americans playing an even greater role in the conflict. In addition to this, what was in our timeline a mostly offensive war would become a mostly defensive war for the United States, as it is likely forts deep within native territory such as Fort Detroit would need to be evacuated. This would mean that while the British would likely still be held at bay in much of the northern border with New York and New England with the exception of Maine, Tecumseh's Confederacy would likely see significant victories occupying lands as far south as the Ohio River. Meanwhile, in the South, while the Creek would likely rise up against the Americans similar to in our own timeline, Andrew Jackson would still be able to defeat the uprising and later muster a victory at the Battle of New Orleans. The greatest change, aside from the gains made by the Confederacy in the Northwest Territory, would be the politics of New England, as in this timeline the Hartford Convention would take on greater prominence. The Hartford Convention in our own timeline played host to many ideas from Federalist New England delegates who wished to bring about an end to the war, and during this convention, radical ideas such as secession were proposed, with the governor of Massachusetts even sending a secret envoy to the British to discuss peace terms. However, ideas such as this failed to gain serious traction as many states held territory out west and hoped to maintain control over them. But in this alternate timeline with war following a far less favorable path for the United States, delegates from the Federalist strongholds of New York, New Jersey, and Delaware would also join the convention. While Jackson's victories in the South did partially help to discredit Federalist fears in our timeline, the losses of the Northwest Territory would be too great to ignore, leading the Federalists to give an ultimatum to the federal government, end the war with Britain, or face secession. Madison, who in our own timeline had gathered troops at Albany in case of New England secession, would likely refuse this, leading to a short but bloody war in the Northeast between the secessionist Federalists and the Federal Democratic Republican forces, which given British presence would likely result in a victory for New England and an end to the War of 1812 later than in our own timeline. With the Americans still achieving victory at New Orleans, it's likely that they would still have some bargaining power in the peace negotiations, but regardless it would be undeniable that the war would be lost. The Federalist states of New York, New Jersey, and the remainder of those in New England would gain independence and become close British allies. Meanwhile, returning to Tecumseh in the Northwest and Upper Louisiana Territory, a vast nation would be carved out for Tecumseh's Confederacy, which would likely adopt the name of the United Indian Nations or the United States of India. Following the war, America would be three separate nations, one in the Northeast being a primarily British-aligned Federalist nation, one in the Northwest being a primarily native country, finally the remainder in the South being what would be left of the United States. Within the United Indian Nations, Tecumseh would fully enact his vision of a pan-Indian confederacy and likely abolish the idea of tribal ownership of land, instead having it be understood to be held in common. This would not be to prevent ownership by individuals or families of land for agriculture, but rather would instead be to break down tribal boundaries to promote cooperation and unity. In addition to this, his brother Tippecanoe's purification movement would likely lose popularity due to the vital role the British played in the war. Economic cooperation between the British and the natives would result in economic growth and even the limited importation of Western manufacturing processes. However, Tecumseh would likely still work to preserve the cultures of the natives. While there would be greater unity among the native tribes due to this, with many seeing themselves as simply Native American or Amerindian, there would likely be a growing ideological rift in the nation between the remnant purists and those wishing to import greater degrees of Western technology. Meanwhile, in New England, we would see the area develop into a larger industrial and commercial hub as British goods entered the nation and its cooperation with the empire increased, with it likely becoming a protectorate of sorts. In addition, the nation would be highly federalist, emphasizing federal power and even potentially dissolving most state divisions to create a unitary state. Finally, there would be what remained of the United States. Jackson, the only successful general of the war, would likely win election to the presidential office in 1824, further democratizing the nation by making the Supreme Court an elected office and eliminating the Electoral College as he had planned to in our timeline. It would be during his second term that he would take action to expand the United States to make up for its lost territory, likely acquiring Spanish Florida, whether that be through hostile or peaceful means, and pushing further into the Southwest. As time would go on, the animosity between America and the nations which broke away from it would not cool down. However, with Britain a world-spanning empire and America being a regional power, a conflict would be unlikely to break out between the powers in the immediate future. That being said, the desire to expand and move westward would still be present, especially as settlers from Virginia, who in our own timeline made up a significant portion of the settlers who today make up the population of the American West, look for new lands to farm and settle. This could lead to a potential war with a newly independent Mexican empire, though given the distance from the start of this timeline, it is uncertain what character that conflict would take on, with the British still holding onto the Oregon Territory, and the Mormons likely still moving out west. We could potentially see the United States attempt to annex all of Mexico, with the British backing Mormon and Californian independence movements to deprive the US of land. The United Indian Nations would have likely grown significantly in population, potentially standing on par with New England or British Canada. Jackson's presidency would likely still see the Indian Removal Act take effect, this time likely seeing cooperation with Tecumseh's Confederacy, who would gladly take in this additional population. Though this could also foment desires from the Confederacy to annex additional lands to the south, or simply prop up the five civilized tribes as a southern ally against the US. All of these factors lead to one conclusion, that the success of Tecumseh's Confederacy would not be the end of hostilities between the Americans, British, and Amber Indians, but instead would be the beginning of a much greater rivalry. But what do you think? How would the success of Tecumseh's Confederacy affect the future of the United States, and the continent as a whole? Let us know in the comments below. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Mr. Z, out.